The Mountain of Blood, an American Uprising. Prologue. The Whisper in the Dark. The year is 1921. You've heard of the Wild West, but have you heard of the Wild East? This is not the quiet America of idyllic farms and bustling city lights. This is the hollows and hills of West Virginia, where the air is thick with coal dust and the silence is a lie, constantly threatened by the roar of the mine and the crack of a rifle. This isn't a strike, it's a war. And for 50,000 men, all that stands between them and a future of dignity is a mountain named Blair. Before we start, I request you to subscribe to my channel and stay tuned. If you subscribe, I will be encouraged to make videos. Imagine the impossible. 10,000 American citizens armed with hunting rifles, pistols, and sheer desperation, marching against the U.S. Army. It's the largest armed insurrection in American history since the Civil War, and the battleground is a remote, forested ridge in Appalachia. Why were they marching? To tear down a system of corporate feudalism that had turned the American dream into a nightmare, where they were paid in company script, lived in company houses, and breathed company air. Their crime? Demanding the right to form a union. Their leader was a coal miner, a sheriff turned hero named Sid Hatfield, and his murder was the spark that ignited the whole powder keg. This is the forgotten history of the Battle of Blair Mountain, a truly unbelievable story of American labor, violence, and the fight for freedom in the nation's coal fields. The company town, a cage disguised as a home. To understand the uprising, one must first understand the company town. These were not just neighborhoods. They were self-contained, corporate-owned worlds that sprung up in the remote valleys of West Virginia, carved out of the wilderness by the insatiable demand for bituminous coal. From the late 1800s onward, as America industrialized, its trains, factories, and battleships all running on the black fuel, the coal operators became kings, and in their kingdom, the miners were little more than serfs. A typical miner, like Frank Keeney, who would later become one of the insurgency's chief organizers, had no real property. His small clapboard house was rented from the company. The doctor who treated his children was paid by the company. The store where he bought his food was the company store, where prices were inflated and he was forced to use scrip, a kind of private corporate money, instead of U.S. currency. This meant that even when the miners worked, they often found themselves in perpetual debt to the very company they slaved for, a debt that could be deducted directly from their paycheck. The operator's ultimate tool of control, however, were the mine guards, or Baldwin Felts detectives. These were private, armed forces, often brutal and ruthless, hired specifically to crush any attempt at unionization. They patrolled the company towns, acting as judge, jury, and executioner. They evicted union organizers, beat dissidents, and searched homes without warrant. To live in a company town was to live under a dictatorship where the only law was the coal company's rule. Mingo County and the Matewan Massacre. The violence escalated to a boiling point in the spring of 1920 in Mingo County, West Virginia, along the Tug Fork River. The miners of the town of Matewan had dared to join the United Mine Workers of America, or UMWA. In response, the formidable Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, led by the ruthless Albert and Lee Felts, arrived to evict the union members from their company homes. The local chief of police, a tall, quiet man with a fierce sense of justice named Sid Hatfield, stood in their way. Hatfield, though he'd briefly worked for the coal companies, had sided with the impoverished miners, a remarkable act of courage and conscience in the heavily controlled region. On May 19, 1920, the Phelps brothers and their men were preparing to leave Matewan after a day of forced evictions. A confrontation erupted near the depot. Sid Hatfield, with his own men and a crowd of enraged miners backing him, faced down the detectives. Exactly who fired the first shot is lost to the chaos of history, but the result was indisputable. A massive, bloody gun battle right in the middle of a small American town. When the smoke cleared, 10 men were dead. Albert Phelps, Lee Phelps, 4 other detectives, and 3 Matewan townsfolk, including the mayor. Chief Sid Hatfield and his men had won the day. The event became known as the Matewan Massacre. To the coal barons, it was a tragedy and an outrage. To the miners, Sid Hatfield became an instant folk hero, the man who stood up to the detectives. Matewan became a flashpoint, a symbol of hope and defiance. The Matewan Massacre did not end the war. It merely marked the end of the beginning. The indictments and the next spark. The state of West Virginia, heavily influenced by the coal lobby, quickly indicted Hatfield and several dozen miners for murder. The Matewan trial became a national sensation, drawing reporters from across the country. In a stunning victory for the miners, the jury, made up mostly of working-class men, acquitted Hatfield and his associates on all charges. But the Baldwin Felts Agency would not forget. The operators in the southern anti-union counties of West Virginia, especially in Logan County, ruled by the iron fist of Sheriff Don Chafin, knew that Matewan had to be avenged and the Union spirit extinguished. On August 1st, 1921, Hatfield and his friend Ed Chambers were slated to appear in the McDowell County Courthouse in Welch on other, lesser charges. They walked up the courthouse steps, unarmed, believing they were under the protection of the law. They were tragically mistaken. Waiting for them were a group of Baldwin Felts men. Hatfield and Ed Chambers were gunned down in cold blood on the steps of the courthouse. The assassins, who were quickly acquitted by a friendly local court, had delivered a message. No one, not even a celebrated local police chief, was safe from the power of the coal companies.
The shockwave from Hatfield's assassination was electric. The hope that had been ignited at Matewan was now fused with a burning, unquenchable rage. The miners of the southern counties, who had endured years of company rule, starvation wages, and armed surveillance, finally saw their path forward with chilling clarity. The law would not protect them. They would have to fight for their freedom. The call to arms. The Union leaders, including Frank Keeney and the fiery Mother Jones, who had been agitating in the coal fields for decades, watched in alarm as the assassination sparked a spontaneous combustion among the miners. Thousands of men left the mines and company towns, gathering in the mountains, bringing their families with them. The rallying point became Lenz Creek Mountain, near the state capital of Charleston. The miners' demands were simple and powerful: the right to unionize without fear of reprisal, and the abolition of the infamous guard system. To achieve this, they knew they had to march into Logan County, the last great ununionized bastion, and defeat the private army of Sheriff Don Chafin. Sheriff Chafin was a formidable opponent, a ruthless, self-styled monarch of Logan County, whose power was financed by the coal operators. He commanded an army of over 3,000 men, known as the Logan Defenders, or the Gun Thugs, all heavily armed with machine guns, high-powered rifles, and fortified trenches along the ridges of Blair Mountain. The miners marched into Logan County was quite literally a march into a prepared battlefield. The journey of the Redneck Army. By late August 1921, An army of between 10,000 and 15,000 miners, poorly organized but galvanized by a shared sense of betrayal and righteous anger, began their march. They tied red bandanas around their necks to distinguish themselves from the anti-union forces, giving rise to the famous American labor term, rednecks. They gathered whatever weapons they could find, family hunting rifles, Civil War-era muskets, and scavenged shotguns. The march was an epic sight, a massive, winding column of men, boys, and even some women, walking through the valleys and over the ridges, a river of humanity flowing toward Logan County. Their initial goal was to walk, to demonstrate the sheer force of their numbers and their resolve. But the march quickly turned into a military operation. As they neared the Mingo-Logan County border, they began to receive intelligence about Chaffin's fortifications. The miners organized into makeshift units, led by veterans of the recent World War I, men who knew how to dig a trench, how to coordinate an attack, and how to survive under fire. Their immediate target became the heavily defended Blair Mountain Ridge, a natural fortress that controlled access to the heart of Logan County.
The lines are drawn. On August 30th, 1921, the first shots of the Battle of Blair Mountain were fired. The miners, now a unified, if still ragged army, faced a formidable line of defense spanning over 15 miles of steep, dense terrain. Sheriff Chaffin's Logan defenders held the high ground, entrenched and equipped with modern machine guns, a terrifying advantage over the miners' scattered rifles. The fighting that erupted was brutal and sustained, lasting for 5 days. The miners used their knowledge of the mountain terrain to their advantage, employing guerrilla tactics, flanking movements, and night raids. The battle was fought on a scale unprecedented in American labor history. The sheer scale of the conflict forced the U.S. government to intervene. President Warren G. Harding viewed the uprising not as a labor dispute, but as a dangerous insurrection against the state. He issued a proclamation demanding the miners cease fire and disperse, a proclamation they largely ignored. The message from Washington was clear. The federal government stood with the coal operators. Federal intervention and aerial bombardment. When the president's warning was ignored, he took the incredible step of ordering federal troops into West Virginia. Units of the U.S. Army, including infantry and machine gun battalions, were dispatched. But before the ground troops could fully engage, the conflict took an even astonishing turn. The first and only time in U.S. history that the federal government used aircraft to bomb its own citizens. The coal operators hired private planes, and the federal government contributed its own pilots to conduct scouting and bombing runs over the miners' positions. The pilots dropped rudimentary pipe bombs and tear gas onto the mountainside. Though largely ineffective in inflicting casualties, the sight and sound of planes attacking Americans on American soil was a terrifying escalation that shattered the miners' morale. The miners fought bravely, but the combination of Chaffin's entrenched machine guns and the presence of the U.S. Army, their own government, was a force they could not overcome. On September 2nd, 1921, facing the full might of the federal military, the miners began to surrender, convinced by Union leaders and the threat of total war that they could not win. The Battle of Blair Mountain was over.
The aftermath and legacy. The cost of freedom. The battle's immediate cost was stark. Though official estimates were low, it is believed that at least 50 to 100 people were killed, miners, deputies, and detectives, and hundreds more were wounded. Thousands of miners were arrested, and the subsequent trials, including a mass treason trial of over 900 men, dragged on for years. Frank Keeney and other major union leaders were indicted and faced years of legal battles, though most were ultimately acquitted or had their charges dropped. More importantly, The Union drive was crushed. The companies had won the war, and the southern West Virginia coal fields remained largely non-unionized until the 1930s. The coal operators had successfully used private force and the support of the U.S. government to maintain their absolute control. The poverty and oppression of the company towns continued. The forgotten uprising. For decades, the story of the West Virginia coal wars and the Battle of Blair Mountain faded into obscurity, overshadowed by other events of the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. It was a story the coal companies and their powerful political allies wanted buried, a story of armed working-class resistance that challenged the very structure of corporate power in America. Yet the fight was not in vain. The sheer scale and ferocity of the miners' uprising drew national attention to the horrific working and living conditions in the coal fields. The memory of the Redneck Army and their willingness to die for a fair shake haunted the industry. The legislative and labor reforms that eventually came with the New Deal in the 1930s, which finally allowed for meaningful union organization, were directly influenced by the bloodshed at Matewan and Blair Mountain. The sacrifices of the marching miners paved the way for the security and rights enjoyed by American workers today. The Battle of Blair Mountain remains a powerful, astonishing chapter in American history. A week of actual war, fought by American workers against private armies and their own federal government, all for the simple, radical idea of a decent life and the freedom to organize. It is the story of the Wild East, where the fight for the soul of American labor was written in blood on a remote Appalachian hillside.
The Sheriff and the System, Don Chafin's Kingdom. The story of the Blair Mountain March cannot be fully told without delving deeper into the nature of the power the miners sought to overthrow. It was a power that coalesced into a single, terrifying figure, Sheriff Don Chafin of Logan County. He was the hinge upon which the entire coal feudal system in southern West Virginia turned. Chafin was not merely a corrupt local official. He was a walking, breathing embodiment of the complete fusion of corporate and state authority. He was elected sheriff of Logan County multiple times, starting in 1908, but his true loyalty was never to the voters. It was to the Logan County Coal Operators Association. This association, made up of powerful companies like the Island Creek Coal Company, effectively bought Chafin and his office, making Logan County the largest, most impenetrable anti-union fortress in the state. The $32,700 man. The financing of Chafin's empire was nakedly corrupt. The law allowed West Virginia counties to levy a special tax to maintain order, often meant for extra deputies or emergency needs. The Logan operators, however, used this mechanism to funnel massive amounts of money directly to Chafin. In a single year, the association was known to have paid him an astounding $32,700, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today, to hire and equip his private army. The money was paid per ton of coal mined, creating a direct, brutal incentive. The more coal produced, the more money for Chafin to crush any resistance. Chafin's deputies, his Logan defenders, were often ex-convicts, hardened mercenaries and thugs who were deputized not to enforce the law, but to enforce the will of the coal companies. They were essentially uniformed private armies, armed with state authority and the best available weapons. Their power was absolute. They controlled all access points to the county, searched every vehicle and train car for union organizers, and ran a network of spies and informants that reached into every hollow and home. Logan County was a state within a state, a dictatorship operating under the thin guise of American democracy. This was the Leviathan that the Redneck Army marched against. The miners were not just fighting for a union, They were fighting to break the chains of a corrupt system where the law was a paid servant of the most powerful corporations. Their march was a direct assault on Chafin's personal fiefdom, an attempt to force the ballot box and the Constitution back into a county that had forgotten both. The man who tried to stop the march, Governor Ephraim Morgan. As the armed miners gathered, the political landscape in West Virginia was thrown into chaos. The elected governor, Ephraim Franklin Morgan, was a lifelong Republican with deep connections to the state's industrial elite, including the very coal operators who bankrode Chafin. His reaction to the escalating conflict illuminates the nearly impossible odds the miners faced. A governor torn. Governor Morgan, though personally opposed to the overt violence of the coal operators, was politically and ideologically aligned against the radicalism of organized labor. He saw the miners' march not as a justifiable protest against exploitation, but as a dangerous act of insurrection that threatened the public peace and the stability of the state's most vital industry. From his executive office in Charleston, Morgan initially tried to handle the crisis without federal intervention. He issued the first of what would be several increasingly stern proclamations ordering the miners to disarm and return home. He promised to send state police to restore order, but the miners, knowing that the state police often sided with the operators, ignored him. After the murder of Sid Hatfield, their faith in any authority not their own had vanished. The appeal to Washington. Morgan's decisive and ultimately fatal move against the miners was his desperate and repeated appeal to President Warren G. Harding to deploy federal troops. Harding, who had initially been reluctant to involve the U.S. Army in a state labor dispute, was eventually convinced by Morgan's dire warnings that West Virginia was on the brink of civil war and that the state lacked the resources to quell the uprising. Morgan framed the conflict not as a fight for workers' rights, but as a violent rebellion against the government itself. The arrival of the 39th Infantry Regiment and other Army units, commanded by Brigadier General Harry Bandholtz, was a turning point. General Bandholtz, a seasoned officer, established a martial presence that the miners could not ignore. The Army brought with it an authority and a firepower that dwarfed anything the miners possessed. The miners understood that they could fight Sheriff Chafin's private army. They could not fight the Stars and Stripes. The governor, by invoking the power of the federal government, had essentially guaranteed the defeat of the workers' movement on Blair Mountain. His actions highlighted a profound truth of the time. In a fundamental conflict between property rights and human rights, the machinery of the American government was prepared to side with property. The men on the march were not just beaten by machine guns, but by the weight of the entire political system.